Conrad was fascinated with maps throughout his life. In his late autobiographical retrospective entitled Some Reminiscences, he recalls a formative incident in his childhood. It was in 1868, when I was 9 years old or thereabouts, that while looking at a map of Africa of the time and putting my finger on the blank space then representing the unsolved mystery of the continent, I said to myself, with absolute assurance and an amazing audacity which are no longer in my character now, when I grow up, I shall go there. 20 years later, Conrad travelled to Stanley Falls, the area on the map he had once imagined as the blankest of blank spaces on the Earth's figured surface. The blank space that Conrad put his finger on may be seen in this map from 1884. A Chinese map of South Africa, believed to be the earliest map of Africa, dates back to 1389, which is more than a century before Western explorers and map makers reached the continent. 5 centuries later, the European map of Africa inched towards its completion. By the time Conrad travelled there in 1890, the mapping was nearly complete. In some important ways, the blank map seems an apt metaphor for the ignorance that Europeans brought to the region, as well as the audacity inherent in the mapping process. The designations of various landmarks with English names instead of their native counterparts is notable in this regard. They assumed, after all, that Africa was full of blank spaces, of voids that the paternal Europeans could fill with commerce and religious conversion. Heart of Darkness was written as the catastrophic consequences of these assumptions were finally beginning to come to light. In one of the odd twists in the long, bloody history of European imperialism, the vast Congo region in Central Africa was colonised by a monarch acting as a private citizen. When he was heir to the Belgian throne, Leopold II, who ruled from 1865 to 1909, had given one of his father's ministers a piece of granite with the inscription, "Belgium needs colonies." And so, when he was King of Belgium, Leopold organised the Congo Company to explore and develop Central Africa. In 1879, Leopold sent the British-American journalist Henry Stanley to the Congo. Stanley emerged with treaties signed with local rulers establishing Leopold's personal claim over the Congo. The Belgian king would now have what he described as his piece of that great African cake. An international conference of representatives of European states, held in Berlin between 1884 and 1885 to discuss claims to African territory, declared the Congo to be the Congo Free State, with Leopold as its head. This Free State, recognised as a private possession of the Belgian king and as part of his business organisation, received the status of a mandate. The Berlin Conference established this designation to signify that a European power accepted the mandate to govern a territory and to provide, in principle, for the welfare of its so-called backward people. The European powers agreed on ground rules governing the race for colonies. Henceforth, no power could simply declare a region its colony unless it exercised effective control over the territory. Despite Leopold's pledge that each colonial power would, quote, undertake to watch over the preservation of the native races and the amelioration of the moral and material conditions of their existence, unquote, the horrors perpetrated on the people of the Congo at Leopold's orders in his quest for ivory and rubber may have been unmatched in the annals of European imperialism. For the indigenous population, the colonial experience was hell on earth. An American missionary reported a gruesome way the Belgian soldiers had of trying to reduce the waste of bullets. To quote, "Each time the corporal goes out to get rubber, cartridges are given to him. He must bring back all not used, and for every one used he must bring back a right hand." In 6 months they had used 6,000 cartridges, which means that 6,000 people are killed or mutilated. It means more than 6,000, for the people have told me repeatedly that soldiers killed children with the butt of their guns. In 1890, the year of Conrad's arrival in the Congo, an American map of Africa by Rand McNally labels a tiny sliver of land northwest of the Congo Free State as unexplored. After sailing to the Congo Free State, Conrad spent nearly a month in Matadi, where he met Roger Casement, a British consul who would become one of Leopold's harshest critics, before beginning the overland journey to Stanley Pool on foot. 36 days later he arrived in Kinshasa, only to learn that instead of captaining the Florida as planned, he was to ship upriver not as a captain but as an ordinary sailor. The 4-week trip seems to have cured Conrad's zest for life at sea. He got out of his contract in the Congo and returned to Europe, haunted by his experiences. King Leopold of Belgium never visited his kingdom in the Congo Free State, but he defended vigorously his treatment of the native population. As missionaries and explorers began to report instances of forced labour, mutilation and murder, public opinion throughout Europe began to turn against him. After the Times newspaper published an editorial accusing him of abuses and atrocities, Leopold decided to respond. On the 17th of July 1906, he sent a letter to the Times containing 37 articles that characterised his actions as humanitarian and Christian in nature. Leopold stressed the need for order and security in the Congo and warned against the native population's laziness and propensity for lying. He insisted that the natives are not unhappy and suggested that Belgian rule in the Congo is more popular than British rule among its colonised African populations. The following document offers a rare glimpse into the rationale that may have inspired his notorious deeds, even as it seals his reputation. Sir, if my government, when formulating the new decrees relating to the Congo, has been especially mindful of the welfare of the natives, it has also had to be careful not to compromise the maintenance of order and internal security. This is at once a national and international calamity. If my views and dealings are not well known in England, the real state of things in the Congo is still less well known. Certain persons seem only to be occupied in finding or inventing faults and crimes. The natives' well-known propensity for lying greatly facilitates their task. Before writing to you, I awaited the return from the Congo of Lieutenant General Barn Wahi, commander of the Army Division of Brussels. He assures me that the natives are not unhappy in the Congo and that their condition is improving, especially in that part of the territory which is exploited by the government. General Wahi is of the opinion that the Congo natives are not longing for a change of rulers. We have brought them into contact with civilization. We are beginning to educate them. We have preserved them from the abuse of alcohol. We have vaccinated them. We are making superhuman efforts to overcome the sleeping sickness, and we are creating numerous and rapid ways of communication. The territory under Leopold's control exceeded 2,600,000 square kilometres, or 1 million square miles. Amid financial problems, it was ruled by a tiny group of administrators drawn from across Europe. Initially, the colony proved unprofitable and insufficient, with the state always close to bankruptcy. The boom in demand for natural rubber, which was abundant in the territory, created a radical shift in the 1890s. To facilitate the extraction and export of rubber, all uninhabited land in the Congo was nationalised, with the majority distributed to private companies as concessions. Some was kept by the state. Between 1891 and 1906, the companies were allowed to do whatever they wished with almost no judicial interference, the result being that forced labour and violent coercion were used to collect the rubber cheaply and maximise profit. A native paramilitary army was also created to enforce the labour policies. Individual workers who refused to participate in rubber collection could also be killed and entire villages razed. Despite these atrocities, the main cause of the population decline was disease, which was exacerbated by the social disruption caused by the Free State. A number of epidemics, notably African sleeping sickness, smallpox, swine influenza and dysentery, ravaged indigenous populations. In 1901 alone, it was estimated that 500,000 Congolese had died from sleeping sickness. Disease, famine and violence combined to reduce the birth rate, while excess deaths rose. In the Free State, Leopold exercised total personal control without much delegation to subordinates. African chiefs played an important role in the administration by implementing government orders within their communities. Throughout much of its existence, however, Free State presence in the territory that it claimed was patchy, with its few officials concentrated in a number of small and widely dispersed stations which controlled only small amounts of hinterland. In 1900, there were just 3,000 white people in the Congo, of whom only half were Belgian. The colony was perpetually short of staff and officials, who numbered between 700 and 1,500 during the period. In the early years of the colony, much of the administration's attention was focused on consolidating its control by fighting the African peoples on the colony's periphery who resisted colonial rule. These included the tribes around the Congo in the southwest and the Uele in the northeast. Some of the violence of the period can be attributed to African groups using colonial support to settle scores or white administrators acting without state approval. The Free State was intended, above all, to be profitable for its investors and Leopold in particular. Its finances were frequently precarious. Early reliance on ivory exports did not make as much money as hoped, and the colonial administration was frequently in debt, nearly defaulting on a number of occasions. A boom in demand for natural rubber in the 1890s, however, ended these problems as the colonial state was able to force Congolese males to work as forced labour, collecting wild rubber which could then be exported to Europe and North America. The rubber boom transformed what had been an unexceptional colonial system before 1890 and led to significant profits. Exports rose from 580 to 3,740 tonnes between 1895 and 1900. In order to facilitate economic extraction from the colony, land was divided up under the so-called domain system in 1891. All vacant land, including forests and areas not under cultivation, was decreed to be uninhabited and thus in the possession of the state, leaving many of the Congo's resources, especially rubber and ivory, under direct colonial ownership. Concessions were allocated to private companies. The Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company was given around 160,000 square kilometres or 62,000 square miles, while two other companies were given smaller concessions in the south and east respectively. Leopold kept 250,000 square kilometres or 97,000 square miles of territory known as a Crown Domain. This was under personal rule, which was added to the territory he already controlled under the private domain. Thus, most economic exploitation of the Congolese interior was undertaken by Leopold and the major concessionaries. The system was extremely profitable and the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company made a turnover of over 100% on its initial stake in a single year. The King made 70 million Belgian francs profit from the system between 1896 and 1905. The Free State's concession system was soon copied by other colonial regimes, notably those in the neighbouring French Congo. With the majority of the Free State's revenues derived from the export of rubber, a labour policy, known by critics as the Red Rubber System, was created to maximise its extraction. Labour was demanded by the administration as taxation. This created a slave society, as companies became increasingly dependent on forcibly mobilising Congolese labour for their collection of rubber. The state recruited a number of black officials, known as capitas, to organise local labour. However, the desire to maximise rubber collection, and hence the state's profits, meant that the centrally enforced demands were often set without considering the numbers or the welfare of workers. In the concessionary territories, the private companies which had purchased a concession from the Free State administration were able to use virtually any measures they wished to increase production and profits without state interference. The lack of a developed bureaucracy to oversee any commercial methods produced an informal atmosphere throughout the state in regards to the operation of enterprises, which in turn facilitated abuses. Treatment of labourers, especially the duration of service, was not regulated by law and instead was left to officials on the ground. The Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company was noted for the harshness with which officials treated Congolese workers. The historian John Stengers described regions controlled by the company as veritable hells on earth. Rubber harvesters were usually compensated for their labour with cheap items, such as cloth, beads, a portion of salt or a knife. On one occasion, a customary chief who ordered his subjects to gather rubber was rewarded with slaves. Workers who refused to supply their labour were coerced with constraint and repression. Dissenters were beaten or whipped. Hostages were taken to ensure prompt collection, and punitive expeditions were sent to destroy villages which refused. The policy led to a collapse of Congolese economic and cultural life, as well as farming in some areas. Much of the enforcement of rubber production was the responsibility of the colonial military. The force had originally been established in 1885 with white officers and non-commissioned officers and black soldiers, and recruited from as far afield as Zanzibar, Nigeria and Liberia. In the Congo, it recruited from specific ethnic and social demographics. These included the Bangala, and this contributed to the spread of the Lingala language across the country, and freed slaves from the eastern Congo. The so-called Zapu Zaps were the most feared. Reportedly cannibals, the Zapu Zaps frequently abused their official positions to raid the countryside for slaves. By 1900, the force numbered 19,000 men. In addition to the army, rubber companies employed their own militias, which often worked in tandem with the force to enforce their rule. The Red Rubber System emerged with the creation of the concession regime in 1891 and lasted until 1906, when the concession system was restricted. At its height, it was heavily localised in the Equator, Bandundu and Kasai regions. Failure to meet the rubber collection quotas was punishable by death. Meanwhile, the force were required to provide the hand of their victims as proof when they had shot and killed someone, as it was believed that they would otherwise use the munitions which were imported from Europe at high cost for hunting or to stockpile them for mutiny. As a consequence, the rubber quotas were in part paid off in chopped off hands. Sometimes the hands were collected by the soldiers of the force, sometimes by the villagers themselves. There were even small wars where villages attacked neighbouring villages to gather hands, since the rubber quotas were too unrealistic to fill. A Catholic priest quotes a man, Tswambe, speaking of the hated state official Leon Fieves, who ran a district along the river 500 kilometres or 300 miles north of Stanley Pool. All blacks saw this man as a devil of the equator, From all the bodies killed in the field, you had to cut off the hands. He wanted to see the number of hands cut off by each soldier who had to bring them in baskets. A village which refused to provide rubber would be completely swept clean. As a young man, I saw Fieve's soldier, Malule, then guarding the village of Bayeka, take a net, put 10 arrested natives in it, attach big stones to the net, and make it tumble into the river. Rubber causes these torments, that's why we no longer want to hear its name spoken. Soldiers make young men kill or rape their own mothers and sisters. One junior officer described a raid to punish a village that had protested. The officer in command, quote, ordered us to cut off the heads of the men and hang them on the village palisades, and to hang the women and the children on the palisade in the form of a cross, unquote. After seeing a Congolese person killed for the first time, a Danish missionary wrote, quote, the soldier said, don't take this to heart so much. They kill us if we don't bring the rubber. The commissioner has promised us if we have plenty of hands, he will shorten our service, unquote. In Forbath's words, quote, the baskets of severed hands set down at the feet of the European post commanders became the symbol of the Congo Free State. The collection of hands became an end in itself. Soldiers brought them to the stations in place of rubber. They even went out to harvest them instead of rubber. They became a sort of currency. They came to be used to make up for shortfalls in rubber quotas, to replace the people who were demanded for the forced labour gangs, and the forced soldiers were paid their bonuses on the basis of how many hands they collected. In theory, each right hand proved a killing. In practice, to save ammunition, soldiers sometimes cheated by simply cutting off the hand and leaving the victim to live or die. Several survivors later said that they had lived through a massacre by acting dead, not moving even when their hands were severed, and waiting till the soldiers left before seeking help. In some instances, a soldier could shorten his service term by bringing more hands than the other soldiers, which led to widespread mutilations and dismemberment. Leopold reportedly disapproved of dismemberment because it harmed his economic interests. He was quoted as saying, cut off hands, that's idiotic. I'd cut off the rest of them, but not hands. That's the one thing I need in the Congo. One practice used to force workers to collect rubber included taking women and family members hostage. Leopold never proclaimed it an official policy, and Free State authorities in Brussels emphatically denied that it was employed. Nevertheless, the administration supplied a manual to each station in the Congo which included a guide on how to take hostages to coerce local chiefs. The hostages could be men, women, children, elders, or even the chiefs themselves. Every state or company station maintained a stockade for imprisoning hostages. Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company agents would imprison the chief of any village which fell behind its quota. In July 1902, one post recorded that it held 44 chiefs in prison. These prisons were in poor condition, and the posts at Bongadanga and Mompono each recorded death rates of 3 to 10 prisoners per day in 1899. Persons with records of resisting the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company were deported to forced labour camps. There were at least 3 such camps, one at Lareko, one on the Upper Maringa River and one on the Upper Lopori River. Aside from rubber collection, violence in the Free State chiefly occurred in connection with wars and rebellions. Native states, notably the Zandi Federation and Swahili-speaking territories in the eastern Congo, refused to recognise colonial authority and were defeated by the force with great brutality during the Congo-Arab War. In 1895, a military mutiny broke out, leading to a 4-year insurgency. The conflict was particularly brutal and caused a great number of casualties. The presence of rubber companies such as the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company exacerbated the effects of natural disasters such as famine and disease. The Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company's tax collection system forced men out from the villages to collect rubber, which meant there were no labour available to clear new fields for planting. This in turn meant that the women had to continue to plant worn-out fields, resulting in lower yields, a problem aggravated by company sentries stealing crops and farm animals. The post at Bonginda experienced a famine in 1899, and in 1900 missionaries recorded a terrible famine across the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company's concession. Leopold sanctioned the creation of child colonies in which orphaned Congolese would be kidnapped and sent to schools operated by Catholic missionaries, in which they would learn to work or be soldiers. These were the only schools funded by the state. More than 50% of the children sent to the schools died of disease, and thousands more died in the forced marches into the colonies. In one such march, 108 boys were sent over to a mission school, and only 62 survived, 8 of whom died a week later. Indigenous Congolese were not the only ones put to work by the Free State. 540 Chinese labourers were imported to work on railways in the Congo. However, 300 of them would die or leave their posts. Caribbean peoples and people from other African countries were also imported to work on the railway, in which 3,600 would die in the first 2 years of construction from railroad accidents, lack of shelter, flogging, hunger, and disease. Historians generally agree that a dramatic reduction in the overall size of the Congolese population occurred during the 2 decades of Free State rule in the Congo. It is argued that the reduction in the Congo was atypical and can be attributed to the direct and indirect effects of colonial rule, including disease and falling birth rate. The historian Adam Hochschild argued that the dramatic fall in the Free State's population was a result of a combination of murder, starvation, exhaustion and exposure, disease and a plummeting birth rate. Sleeping sickness was also a major cause of fatality at the time. Opponents of Leopold's rule stated, however, that the administration itself was to be considered responsible for the spreading of the epidemic. Although it is impossible to be sure in the absence of records, violence and murder represented only a portion of the total. In a local study of the Kuba and Keti peoples, the historian Jan van Sina estimated that violence accounted for the deaths of less than 5% of the population. Diseases imported by Arab traders, European colonists and African porters ravaged the Congolese population and greatly exceeded the numbers killed by violence. Smallpox, sleeping sickness, dysentery, venereal diseases, especially syphilis and gonorrhea, and swine influenza were particularly severe. Lawyer Raphael Lemkin attributed the quick spread of disease in the Congo to indigenous soldiers employed by the state, who moved across the country and had sex with women in many different places, thus spreading localised outbreaks across a larger area. Sleeping sickness in particular was epidemic in large areas of the Congo and had a high mortality rate. In 1901 alone, it is estimated that as many as 500,000 Congolese died from sleeping sickness. Van Sina estimated that 5% of the Congolese population perished from swine influenza. In areas in which dysentery became endemic, between 30 and 60% of the population could die. Van Sina also pointed to the effects of malnutrition and food shortages in reducing immunity to the new diseases. The disruption of African rural populations may have helped to spread diseases further. Nevertheless, historian Roger Anstey wrote that a strong strand of local oral tradition holds the rubber policy to have been a greater cause of death and depopulation than either the scourge of sleeping sickness or the periodic ravages of smallpox. It is also widely believed that birth rates fell during the period too, meaning that the growth rate of the population fell relative to the natural death rate. Van Sina, however, notes that pre-colonial societies had high birth and death rates, leading to a great deal of natural population fluctuation over time. Among the Kuba, the period between 1880 to 1900 was actually one of population expansion. A reduction of the population of the Congo is noted by several researchers who have compared the country at the beginning of Leopold's control with the beginning of Belgian state rule in 1908, but estimates of the death toll vary considerably. Estimates of some contemporary observers suggest that the population decreased by half during this period. According to Edmond D. Morel, the Congo Free State counted 20 million souls. Other estimates of the size of the overall population decline range between 2 and 13 million. Asherson cites an estimate by Roger Casement of a population fall of 3 million, although he notes that it is almost certainly an underestimate. Peter Forbath gave a figure of at least 5 million deaths, while John Gunther also supports a 5 million figure as a minimum death estimate and estimates 8 million as a maximum. Lemkin estimated that 75% of the population was killed. In the absence of a census providing even an initial idea of the population of the region at the inception of the Congo Free State, it is impossible to quantify population changes in the period. Despite this, Forbath more recently claimed the loss was at least 5 million. Adam Hochschild and Jan van Sina use the number 10 million. Hochschild cites several recent independent lines of investigation by anthropologists Jan van Sina and others that examine local sources, such as police records, religious records, oral traditions, genealogies and personal diaries, which generally agree with the assessment of the 1919 Belgian Government Commission, that roughly half the population perished during the Free State period. Since the first official census by the Belgian authorities in 1924 put the population at about 10 million, these various approaches suggest a rough estimate of a total of 10 million dead. Jan van Sina returned to the issue of quantifying the local population decline and revised his earlier position. He concluded that the Cuba population was rising during the first 2 decades of Leopold's rule and declined by 25% from 1900 to 1919, mainly due to sickness. Others argued a decrease of 20% over the first 40 years of colonial rule up to the census of 1924. Lewis and Stengers state that the population figures at the start of Leopold's control were only wild guesses, while calling E.D. Morel's attempt and others at coming to a figure for population losses but figments of the imagination. However, authors that point out the lack of reliable demographic data are questioned by others by calling the former minimalists and agnosticists. Eventually, growing scrutiny of Leopold's regime led to a popular campaign movement centred in the United Kingdom and the United States to force Leopold to renounce his ownership of the Congo. In many cases, the campaigns based their information on reports from British and Swedish missionaries working in the Congo. The first international protest occurred in 1890 when George Washington Williams, an American, published an open letter to Leopold about abuses he had witnessed. In a letter to the United States Secretary of State, he described conditions in the Congo as crimes against humanity, thus coining the phrase, which would later become key language in international law. Public interest in the abuses in the Congo Free State grew sharply from 1895, when the Stokes Affair and reports of mutilations reached the European and American public, which began to discuss the Congo question. To appease public opinion, Leopold instigated a commission for the protection of natives, composed of foreign missionaries, but made few serious efforts at reform. In the United Kingdom, the campaign was led by the activist E.D. Morel after 1900, whose 1906 book Red Rubber reached a mass audience. Notable members of the campaign included novelists Mark Twain, Joseph Conrad and Arthur Conan Doyle, as well as a number of Belgian socialists. In May 1903, a debate in the British House of Commons led to the passing of a resolution in condemnation of the Congo Free State. A few days later, the British consul in the town of Boma, Roger Casement, began touring the Congo to investigate the true extent of the abuses. He delivered his report in December, and a revised version was forwarded to the Free State authorities in February 1904. In an attempt to preserve the Congo's labour force and stifle British criticism, Leopold promoted attempts to combat disease to give the impression that he cared about the welfare of the Congolese, and invited experts from the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine to assist. Free State officials also defended themselves against allegations that exploitative policies were causing severe population decline in the Congo by attributing the losses to smallpox and sleeping sickness. Campaigning groups such as the Congo Reform Association did not oppose colonialism and instead sought to end the excesses of the Free State by encouraging Belgium to annex the colony officially. This would avoid damaging the delicate balance of power between France and Britain on the continent. While supporters of the Free State regime attempted to argue against claims of atrocities, a commission of inquiry appointed by the regime in 1904 confirmed the stories of atrocities, and pressure on the Belgian government increased. In 1908, as a direct result of this campaign, Belgium formally annexed the territory, creating the Belgian Congo. Conditions for the indigenous population improved dramatically with the partial suppression of forced labour, although many officials who had formerly worked for the Free State were retained in their posts long after annexation. Instead of mandating labour for colonial enterprises directly, the Belgian administration used a coercive tax that deliberately pressured Congolese to find work with European employers to procure the necessary funds to make the payments. For some time after the end of the Free State, the Congolese were also required to provide a certain number of days' service per year for infrastructure projects. As eyewitness reports and photographs of atrocities occurring in King Leopold's Congo Free State proliferated, governments and citizens of other countries began to take notice. In 1885, several nations signed the Berlin Act, which charged the Congo government to bind themselves to watch over the preservation of the native tribes and to care for their moral and material welfare. The United Kingdom was one of the signatories. Thus, the government sent British Consul Roger Casement to the Congo Free State to investigate the accumulating reports of abuses against the native population. Casement's report was published in 1904. The full report runs 40 pages long, with an additional 20 pages of individual statements gathered from victims and witnesses alike, who report killings, mutilations, kidnappings and beatings of men, women and children by soldiers of Bula Madadi, the name used by the natives for the Congo administration of King Leopold. Copies of the report were sent to the Belgian government as well as to the governments of countries that were signatories to the 1885 Berlin Act, including Germany, France and Russia. As a result, international pressure to reform began to mount. The Congo administration was forced to investigate the atrocities documented by Casement, leading to the arrest and punishment of some white officials responsible for these acts. Casement's report was instrumental in bringing the troubling nature of European activity in the Congo Free State to light. With his endorsement and support, British journalist and shipping agent E.D. Morel founded the Congo Reform Association, which burgeoned into the first major human rights initiative in modern history. Other early voices of dissent included African-American politician, historian and Civil War veteran George Washington Williams, who was the first to publicise the plight of the Congolese. After meeting Leopold in 1889, he travelled to the Congo in 1890. His missive, entitled An Open Letter to His Serene Majesty Leopold II, King of the Belgians and Sovereign of the Independent State of Congo, is the earliest public indictment of Leopold's actions there. African-American Presbyterian missionary William Henry Shepherd, who spent nearly 20 years living in the Congo, vigorously endeavoured to publicise the atrocities he witnessed. I have the honour to submit my report on my recent journey on the Upper Congo. The region visited was one of the most central in the Congo state. Moreover, I was enabled by visiting this district to contrast its present state with the condition in which I had known it some 16 years ago. and I was thus able to institute a comparison between a state of affairs I had myself seen when the natives lived their own savage lives in anarchic and disorderly communities, uncontrolled by Europeans, and that created by more than a decade of very energetic European intervention by Belgian officials in introducing their methods of rule over one of the most savage regions of Africa. The people have not easily accommodated themselves to the altered conditions of life brought about by European government in their midst. Where formerly they were accustomed to take long voyages down to Stanley Pool to sell slaves, ivory, dried fish or other local products, they find themselves today debarred from all such activity. The open selling of slaves and the canoe convoys which navigated the upper Congo have everywhere disappeared. But much that was not reprehensible in native life has disappeared along with it. The trade in ivory has today entirely passed from the hands of the natives of the upper Congo. Complaints as to the manner of exacting service are frequent. If a local official has to go on a sudden journey, men are summoned on the instant to paddle his canoe, and the refusal entails imprisonment or a beating. If the government plantation or the kitchen garden require a weeding, a soldier will be sent to call on the women from some of the neighbouring towns. To the women suddenly forced to leave their household tasks and to tramp off, hoe in hand, baby on back, with possibly a hungry and angry husband at home, the task is not a welcome one. During the course of these operations, there had been much loss of life, accompanied, I fear, by a somewhat general mutilation of the deed, as proof that the soldiers had done their duty. 2 cases of mutilation came to my actual notice while I was in the Lake District. One, a young man, both of whose hands had been beaten off with the butt ends of rifles against a tree, the other a young lad of 11 or 12 years of age, whose right hand was cut off at the wrist. In both these cases, the government soldiers had been accompanied by white officers, whose names were given to me. Of 6 natives, 1 girl, 3 little boys, 1 youth, and 1 old woman, who had been mutilated in this way during the rubber regime, all except 1 were dead at the date of my visit. As opposition from the international community grew and financial support for his undertakings declined, Leopold maintained his unapologetic stance. The Belgian parliament, stung by revelations of brutality uncovered by international investigations, demanded more humane standards. In 1908, it took the Congo away from Leopold and made it a colony of Belgium, a country 1/80th the size of its colony. Leopold died the following year. More than a century after his death, Leopold continues to fascinate and repel historians, while the Belgian government continues to grapple with Leopold's legacy. Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost, a 1998 book written in the genre of popular history that characterises the king as a tyrant, was a surprise bestseller that inspired a 2006 documentary by the same name. Translated into a dozen languages, its astonishing success suggests that Leopold's spectre still haunts the imagination of an international audience. To that end, human rights organisations assert that Leopold's name belongs next to Hitler, Stalin and other men whose names live on in infamy. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe.